Okay, let's open up for some questions here. I think we got our microphones if we're going to still use those today. Raise your hand, they'll find you, and love to hear whatever's on your mind as far as either the material today, or if you have questions still from last night, or just another question you want to ask. This is your shot. Okay, right here. Not sure that's on in the back there, but we'll see. Go ahead.
When I am interacting with like my atheist friend or my coworkers that are non-believers, and I progress along with them throughout our journey together in life, and I talk to them about the Bible, and I know there's not an exact answer, but at what point do you kind of just say, I can't interact with you anymore about this stuff? Because, especially with my postmodern friend, I find that it gets to a point where it just frustrates me, and I'm supposed to love them, but I get to a point where I'm like, I don't know what else. I've laid my case out, talked to them, and it's just like, they're just so deep in their sin, I think, that I just can't. I know there's not an exact, but if you have any advice.
It's a great question. So if you didn't hear the question is, at what point do you find yourself going round and around and around with your non-Christian friend at the point of exasperation? You're just like, okay, let's be done here. And of course, I can't give you, as you said, I can't give you the time on that. I can say that experience is very common, especially if you have a family member or a buddy that you're always with, and you feel like you've just kind of gone down that road 100 times, you're just missing each other. What do you do then? Well, a couple things. First of all, don't feel the need in the interactions you have with your non-Christians to always be in debate mode, right? I think sometimes we have this impression that if I'm a faithful Christian, every time I bump into my non-Christian friend, I'm like hammering away at them about everything we've been talking about, right? And you don't have to do that. You can just go to the movies or go to dinner with your non-Christian friend. You don't always have to talk about these issues. The second thing I would say is that part of the way we get them introduced to the gospel isn't just by virtue of dialogue or argumentation, which I think are valid. But there's other ways I think we know and that are very basic. I mean, one idea is just invite them to church. Say, look, I don't want to argue with you. I just want you to come to church with me. Just come with me a couple Sundays and sit in there and tell me what you think. Or one other thing is to say, look, can we do a Bible study together where we don't talk about whether this is true or not, but we just study what it says? How about that? And I've seen that be effective. And then there's just time. Sometimes you just need to love your non-Christian friend, spend time with them, and then over time, trust that if the Spirit's going to work, the Spirit will work on them. But I mean, those are tough situations, and we just got to continue to bathe them in prayer. So great question. All right, other questions. You can just raise your hand where you are, and if you speak loudly, I think I might be able to hear you.
I got a lot of voice.
Okay.
I have a question, because for the past decade, I've had a contradiction brought up to me a lot, because I'm a Christian woman. And I guess, like, 1 Timothy in chapter 2 has a lot of negativity towards women.
Mm-hmm.
And one contradiction that is brought up to me a lot, and a lot of my friends are atheists and agnostics or whatever you want to call them, but the majority of my friends are. And I also was teaching in the church that I grew up in at the time, or not grew up in, we went together for a while for the time, and it has caused me to be a skeptic in the Word myself, because I sought the answer through websites, through leaders in the church, and I got called a feminist for asking those questions.
Sure, yeah.
Because they didn't have answers. And so, but, it says in, what is it, 1 John 3:16, God, for God so loved the world, He brought His Son to die for everyone. But in 1 Timothy 2, I think that's, what is it, verse 15, that women are saved through childbirthing. So,
yeah. Well, all of 1 Timothy 2 and then even into 3 has caused all kinds of people to sort of struggle. A couple things there on that passage. One is, keep in mind that having a passage that's confusing or difficult is not at all surprising. That is one of 50 I could list out. I'm sure you could too. of other passages in the Bible you read like, what, a world? And what do I do with that? But is one passage that's confusing or complicated for us enough to think the whole thing is shot? And I would suggest not. And the reason is because I think, wouldn't you expect that there's going to be a confusing or complicated passage in the Bible that you can't fully understand? I would say yes. As far as that particular passage, women saved through childbirth, actually there's been a lot of good scholarly work on that. If you want to come and talk to me afterwards, I can point you to places that have looked at that, or send me an email and I can refer them to you. You have to realize that it's not talking about salvation there, as if people who don't have babies don't go to heaven, or something like that. And you can deduce that not only from the flow of the context there in 1 Timothy, but also you have to realize the word save there has multiple connotations in Greek. Sozo is what the word is. It doesn't always mean save as in go to heaven or not go to heaven, but the idea that fruitful life, if you will, even in this temporal earth, can come through childbearing. And it's not the kind of thing that requires everybody to have a child, but it doesn't have anything to do with whether someone goes to heaven. But what I would say is that make sure you whatever difficult passage you come across is not in itself a reason to think the whole thing is in question. I mean, I have plenty that I struggle with, and I've read a lot of the Bible. And so I think there's hope there that one passage shouldn't derail the whole thing. Talk to me afterwards, and I'll give you some more resources on that.
The temple in the John versus the cleansing of the temple in John versus the Gospels, how would you talk about that?
Okay, the question up here, if you didn't hear, was, here's a supposed contradiction, is that when you look at the order of the Gospels, John has the cleansing of the temple at the beginning, and the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke have it at the end. Well, which one is it? Isn't this another contradiction, people say? I don't think so, and there's a couple, I think, possible answers to that. One is, I've already mentioned the non-chronological order of the Gospels. Lots of times, the stories moved around for thematic reasons. It would make a lot of sense why John would move the cleansing of the temple earlier in the life of Jesus, because if you read the Gospel of John and looked at some of the major commentaries, you know that the temple theme is big in John. And it seems that he wanted to hit that theme from the very start. One other possibility, actually, is that Jesus would have cleansed the temple at both ends of his ministry, as he started his ministry and as he ended it, sort of as a bookend to his ministry. John captures the first of those, and the synoptics capture it right before Jesus dies. I actually think that's pretty plausible. In fact, I had a seminary paper just last week where someone defended that view, and it's actually a very widespread view. D.A. Carson's a good example of someone who holds the two cleansings view. I think either one's an option in that story. Good. Yep.
There are places where Paul says, this is my opinion, and such. Do we kind of approach that as sort of like the Proverbs, where it could be wisdom applied to a appropriate circumstance?
So you're referring to 1 Corinthians 7, I believe, here, where Paul says, these are not the Lord's words, but my words. And he says that multiple times. Actually, I don't think that's a passage that's referring to Paul, where Paul's demoting his words as not inspired or just his opinion. When he says, these are my words, not the Lord's, I think what's going on there, and the major commentaries would agree on this, I think what's going on there is that Paul is saying, we don't have direct teaching from Jesus in his earthly ministry on this topic, so I'm speaking to it myself. And so it's not an issue of Jesus' words are authoritative, and then there's Paul, and this is just my opinion. But rather, you have the explicit words of Jesus on this topic, and for the topics he doesn't address, I, Paul, am speaking to it. So not I, but the Lord is speaking to this topic. A good commentary on that is Gordon Fee's commentary on 1 Corinthians, who gives actually a fairly good defense of that position.
And doesn't Paul go ahead and defend his saying as one who has been chosen by Christ to give this message? So it is more than just an opinion.
Yeah, so when you read Paul's letters, he often goes out of his way in his letters. This is particularly true in Galatians 1, to make sure his apostolic office is understood, defended, that, hey, I'm speaking for Christ, I'm not an apostle of Christ, I saw the risen Christ. And why does he do that? Because he wants you to know that he is speaking authoritatively. So, as odd as it is to read a letter from someone, you think, well, is this authoritative? Well, yeah, it is. I mean, it's not so much just Paul saying, here's my private opinions on this, but this is really the words of word of the Lord to you. And he says that in a number of places. Good question. Yep.
I hear you arguing a lot that the church has used the Bible in the past to stand on grounds of supporting, I guess, interracial marriage, supporting segregation, Jim Crow laws, back to slavery.
Sure.
So how would you address that today, saying now you're standing on using the Bible as grounds against same-sex marriage?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question there, if you didn't hear it, was, well, haven't people used the Bible to defend all kinds of bad things in the past? So maybe people use the Bible to say that interracial marriage is wrong or this sort of thing. And then doesn't that give us reasons to think that maybe the Bible's wrong about same-sex marriage now? Yeah, this is a common argument. I think the response to that argument, though, is fairly straightforward, which is, yeah, the people use the Bible for all kinds of things. And it's not just limited to those things. You know, everybody wants to claim the Bible for their own pet views. And so we could go throughout all of human history and find all kinds of wacky fringe views that people use the Bible to support. I mean, you could look at Marshall Applewhite. If you remember the name Marshall Applewhite? In 1994, he thought the Bible taught that Christ was going to return in the Hale-Bopp comet. And if everybody committed suicide, they could join Jesus in the Hale-Bopp comet that was going around the earth. And so the Marshall Applewhite cult used the Bible to defend the idea that there's aliens and comets and these sorts of things. Then you're like, well, okay, but what does that really infringe upon the authority of the Bible, or is that just an example of someone trying to hijack the Bible for their own ends? And so what I always encourage people to do is like, look, people try to use the Bible for all kinds of things, and that still happens in the modern day. And so I say, look, let's study the Bible for ourselves. Let's go in and find out what it says if someone is a skeptic, and really take a look at these particular issues. And when they do, I think they'll find that the Bible is actually plain and persuasive about a lot of those questions. Now, that's different than whether they like the answer, right? So if you say the Bible really does teach that marriage is between a man and a woman, they may think, well, I don't like that. I'm like, well, once again, that goes back to an early point. You may not like it. That's not an argument. And you've got to come up with something better than that. But that doesn't mean the Bible teaches the crazy things that people have said it's taught. That's always going to be true, even going forward in time. Good question. Yeah, I see a hand back here.
You had brought up and discussed the dynamic whereas Christians were often put on the defensive to defend the Bible and our faith, and how it's almost a double standard when you then try and put somebody who's an atheist or doesn't believe in Christianity in the same box where they have to defend what they believe or why they don't believe Christianity. I'm just curious to hear why you think that dynamic seems so prevalent in our culture today, where you're immediately on the defensive as a Christian.
Yeah, well, I think Christians themselves create the dynamic partially. And I think part of it is being on the receiving end of so much verbal attack that after a while you sort of just go into pure defensive mode. Okay? So think of like a boxing match. If someone's throwing a lot of punches, the other person's going to do a lot of blocking. Okay? And so what you have in the Christian world is that we're just doing a lot of blocking. We're just trying not to get hit. Okay? What I want to suggest is that rather than just blocking punches, we need to throw some of our own. Okay? And I mean that in all the right ways. Okay? This is everybody's, especially this is being filmed. Let's just go out and pick fights with people. I mean, intellectually punching. We need to go on the offense. And so, yeah, I think it's a product of being, to some extent, a sub-part of our culture that's received a lot of attack, and you end up sort of getting in a defensive mode. I think my encouragement is that we need to think outside of that and really realize that non-Christian too needs to account for his worldview. It's hard to do. I think we're also trained to think that if I challenge a person's worldview, that I'm being sort of mean or offensive, or I'm telling other people they're wrong. And by golly, the last thing I want to do in my culture now is tell someone they're wrong. So I'm just going to take it on the chin and kind of hope I make it or I survive. I think that whole apologetic method is broken and needs to be rethought. So thus, I think we need to think about how to ask good questions, not just answer questions. We need to ask questions. Yep.
I've always wondered about this one in Exodus 33, where it's Moses is speaking to the Lord. In one verse it says he speaks to the Lord speaks to Moses face to face. Then, not but 10 verses later, it says, "You cannot see my face." And I think I can understand the surface level answer to that with the idioms, and you can't take it literally, and there's how they wrote. But why? Why do you think there's apparent contradictions like that in the Bible?
Yeah, actually, this one I think has got a fairly straightforward answer to it. By the way, I appreciate the let's crack the Bibles open and find my toughest questions. This is great. Actually, I don't get many groups doing that, so that's well done on your part. So to say that God speaks to Moses face to face is in fact what we call a sort of a euphemism. And what we mean by that is it's a way of saying that he speaks to Moses personally and directly. Okay? This is what he enjoyed as his status as a distinctive prophet of God, is that when God spoke to Moses, he didn't speak to anybody else like that. Okay? He spoke to him directly, he spoke to him personally. He had a time with him where he would bring him up on the mountain and he and God would fellowship together. So to say that he spoke to God face to face is a way of speaking of his prophetic role as a direct recipient of God's revelation. But then you've got the other part where he says, you can't see my face. This is an anthropomorphic language to say, I can't fully unveil my glory to you. If I fully unveil my glory to you, you're gonna die. And so God partially veils his glory so that Moses doesn't die in God's presence. And we use language like, you can't see my face. We know that God doesn't actually have a face. He's a spirit. He doesn't have a physical face, but it's a way of God saying, I'm veiling my glory so you don't completely perish under it. So those two aren't at all contradictory. One deals with the mode by which God speaks to Moses, and one speaks to the limitations he has in the way he unveils his glory to Moses. But I also want you to think about this. Is it really possible that the writer of Exodus, 10 verses later, just forgot what he wrote in the earlier 10 verses and never noticed his own obvious contradiction? I mean, this is one of the things I always say to people, is like, look, either the Bible writers are sort of a bunch of morons who couldn't even remember what they said 10 verses ago, or maybe there's another option here. And this is the same in the Gospels. And I think this is a good example of how English language, even using the word face, makes it sound like a contradiction, but I really think those are talking about two very, very different things. Okay, I see a hand here.
For dismantling other people's worldviews, which worldviews have you come in contact that have had a pretty substantial counter-argument?
Okay, so the question there was, which non-Christian worldviews do the best in having a coherent system?
Yeah.
Okay.
Versus just my feelings or my opinion.
So first thing to recognize is that hardly ever happens. Okay? And what I mean by that is that most non-Christians you talk to have a very patchwork, piecemeal, random, internally contradictory worldview. They never thought about it, and you point that out to them, and it's going to completely implode on itself. The worldviews that have the best shot of being coherent are actually theistic worldviews. And so if you can come up with a coherent, internally rational theistic worldview, you're going to have a good shot of making it a little further down the argumentative path. The problem, though, is that you can't just create your own theistic worldview from scratch. You end up buying into one of the existing ones. And so you're really dealing with sort of, as far as monotheistic worldviews go, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are really the three games in town. Judaism being, in some sense, a subset of Christianity, if I can say it that way, you're really only talking about Islam as the only real competitor, so to speak, that could argue for a monotheistic worldview that could sort of mimic our every move, so to speak. But that only looks like that on the surface, because once you break down Islam, it has a pile of problems internally that I think are very easy to point out, and something that we'd want to point out. And I would direct you to, I mentioned James Anderson a minute ago. He's got an elective at RTS. I'm not sure it's on the mobile app. I have to look. But it's an elective on Islam. And he goes through the Islamic worldview and just breaks it down. It's really helpful. So would I say that's the worldview with the best shot of competing with Christianity? Probably, but I don't think it really competes. I think it's on the surface the best shot of competing. You have to come up with some sort of theistic system.
Dr. Kruger, could you give us like a little thumbnail sketch of how to maybe apply some of the early arguments from the beginning of Christianity to encounters with different kind of Christian sects that are theistic, but something like our Mormon friends or our Jehovah's Witness friends, to kind of talk about different quote-unquote Christian worldviews?
Yeah. I think I understand your question. So obviously you have a lot of cult groups circulating. You know, we think about Mormons, JWs, there's others. People sort of look at those and think, well, how'd those pop up and why are they here and how do I handle them? Well, again, we would always base everything on Scripture. When you look at Scripture, those groups depart significantly from Orthodox teaching, but in particular, they depart from the long history of teaching the church has had. One of the ways we gauge orthodoxy is not just privately looking at my Bible sitting under a tree somewhere. Part of the way we gauge orthodoxy is by looking at the large swath of Christian heritage behind us. In other words, what have Christians been saying for thousands of years about the Trinity, about Jesus, about the Bible, and so on. And when you ask it that way, these groups become immediately obvious as fringe groups. And in early Christianity, they had their own fringe groups. If you lived in the 2nd century, it wouldn't have been Jehovah's Witnesses you were worried about. It would have been Gnostics that you were worried about. A bunch of the Gnostic, Valentinian, Gnostic sects all the time causing trouble. And the Orthodox guys were always trying to fight them. And it's very similar to our day in the same kind of idea.
We have time for maybe one more question.
All right, right here, one more. Make it a good one, man. You're the last one. Yeah, all the pressure.
The synoptic problem, the theory of that Matthew and Luke got a copy of Mark, and Mark used Q, and they both had each other's kind of gospel as theirs was written and found in history when the viruses were found.
Okay, so great question. So he's like, help us understand what's called the synoptic problem. In other words, the synoptic problem is the relationship of Matthew, Mark, and Luke to each other. And did they use earlier sources? Okay, this is a big question in modern scholarship. If you download my Gospels class, I have an extended lecture on this. The quick answer is this. I think there's every good reason to think Matthew, Mark, and Luke knew each other. They would have all moved within the apostolic circle. I don't think there's any reason to think it's a problem for one gospel author to rely on another source outside his own brain. He's going to use sources as they write. Part of the hiccup for people on the synoptic problem is this mysterious Q source. Okay, is there another source out there called Q that's an earlier gospel that was used by Matthew and Luke? That's a scholarly theory. It's by no means proven. I'm skeptical about the specificities of Q. I don't think there's anything like Q that can be ascertained with the detail that scholars ascertain it. I always remind my students that in terms of manuscripts and in terms of historical discoveries, there's no such thing as a Q gospel. It doesn't exist. There's never been one found. It's just a purely hypothetical reconstruction in the mind of scholars. They're pretty certain about it, but it's very, very hypothetical. I tell my students too, I was like, if you wanted to check out Q from the library, you can do that. There's a book called Q. You can go in the library and it gives you what all they think is in Q, which is just parts of Matthew and Luke anyway. But nonetheless, they think that's an early gospel. So I'm pretty skeptical about the specifics of Q, but I think things like Q could have existed. I talked about this last night under the heading of apocryphal gospels. I think, do we probably have early sources of Jesus out there that theoretically could be discovered that might be like Q? Possibly. We haven't found any of them, but I think it's hypothetically possible. So I don't have an objection to Q in principle. I have an objection to Q in terms of the specific reconstructions as scholars are absolutely certain to contain these verses and not others. I find that to be dubious on a number of levels. Okay, I'm turning back over to our host here.